Hey everyone, ErikOnPaper here, and if you hadn't figured it out, I'm Erik. So for this tutorial, I thought I would show you how I did the preliminary drawings and inking of this steel piece. And this was commissioned by a good friend of mine, Andrew Lee Creech. You can check out and follow him here. I mean, at the text, not below where I'm sitting. Very talented actor and playwright. He got me started on my acting path too, so you can thank or blame him depending on your viewpoint. But let's get started. When deciding on a pose, don't be afraid to use a model for reference. In this case, I used this 12-inch figure and based my pose on that. Now, when you draw your oval for the head shape and space it out, most superheroes that you're going to draw are 7 heads tall, give or take. And once you start working your shapes and your figures, aligning it with each head, and I'll do a more detailed tutorial on that coming soon, start roughing in the shapes for the face, and it is going to be completely okay to erase. You just don't want to get too detailed too early. And as I'm blocking in the musculature, I made that arm too big, so I erase it, and nothing wrong with that. And uh, even though uniform detailing is important because it's what people gravitate to, they like the costume, they like the look, just start roughing in the muscles as you would a generic figure, and then you can customize on top of that. And also, don't rely too much on the musculature of your reference figure. Like, steel, for example, is a very powerfully built figure. And so, what I had to do is keep bulking him up, and in some cases, over bulking and then going back. But even you can see a lot of his wardrobe detailings, his tech, his design, and things like that. I blocked him with simple shapes, and yeah, I had to refine and change up the arm, and then went in and added facial details. I decided I wanted him as kind of a badass, tough, don't mess with me pose. And then deciding on the shadows, I wanted the light coming down from overhead, so using that same figure, adjust the light source where I wanted, and start penciling in accordingly. Now, you can start roughing in even larger black solids like I will underneath his right arm here. And many times pencilers will define their shadow areas by drawing a solid shape and marking an X inside, so the inker will be able to fill that in as just a dark solid, like you can see with the groin armor here. But for me, and the demonstration purposes, I happen to like uh, illustrating exactly where the shadows are. And to get more of a graphic look, you can go into various kinds of hatchings and cross hatchings, like along the hammer here, and especially underneath his arm. I didn't want it just to be a solid black and lose some detail, so you can do various kinds of hatching and cross hatching in order to get some depth and give the figure shape and texture. Now, onto the inking. We're going to take a lot more time on this since this is more of an inking tutorial, and I'm starting with a 0.005 micron. It's the smallest one they make. A myth is that you can only get one level of thickness from a micron, and that isn't true. Depending on how you hold the pen and the pressure you apply, you can get many degrees of thickness within that, and even from this 0.005, I do a thinner line on the outside of the lip, a thicker line on the inside, and a thinner line on the outside. And sometimes you can go back over pieces, uh, just depending on the look you want. If you want a rough, sketchy look, speed along your lines. But if you want your piece to look more refined, uh, then go back and take your time when going over lines. And I use the 0.005 for all of the very fine details, and also when inking a symmetrical thing, like the rivets on his head, make sure that they go across as precisely as you can. And I switch it out here to actually a 0.3 marker, because if you make all the lines the same thickness, because even though you can change the line of the pen, you can only do so much. The 0.3, what you can do, I find, is give your characters a really nice pop, especially in the details, because I tend to like inking with a thinner line. And don't be afraid to move the paper around, rotate it as needed. It's supposed to conform to the stroke of your hand, the stroke of the pen. And now using the 01 marker, it's a good step up from the 005. And I use that just for thicker lines that are meant to be details, but not like extra fine details. As you can see his head here, I'm using that to indicate texturing and show the shape of the head with the line placement and using it to fill in some of the more shadowy areas. I don't often use the 0.8 micron for detailing work just for effects or filling in shadows like you see here, but I do like to use it for outlining shadow shapes because then what I can do is go in, and there I am just adding some details. Don't be married to your pencils. If you spot something and you think, oh, I want a line to go there, but I didn't pencil it in, well, don't worry about it. Just go in and add those lines. You can always take it out later, and I will show you how. So yeah, just back to using a 3 and outlining the cape, but what I was saying about the 0.8s is yeah, I use that to outline the shadows, and then I can go in with maybe not so nice or refined a pen brand or even ink, and just use that to fill in large blacks, because if I'm going to scan this piece digitally, I'll end up clamping down on those layers to make it a solid black, so the ink quality won't matter as much. And here I am filling in the cape shadows using just a simple hatch, and that creates a gray to your eye in a black and white image. And what that does is it breaks up the shape and allows the form to look like, well, it has a form. And on small areas of shadow, I just fill in with a 0.8 marker, or 0.8 micron, excuse me, like you're seeing here. And one thing I wanted to point out that you may see me doing is I am holding the micron not against my knuckle, but resting against the fleshy part of my hand. And it may feel weird at first, but this is how you can get a lot of control. Your lines get looser and freer, and your hand does not get tired from drawing. So, to quote Captain America, I can do this all day. But I can't take any credit for discovering that. That trick actually comes from the great Neil Adams. So when I'm inking these areas, I want my lines to start thick and end up thin. That indicates a shadow, and also a static uniform line doesn't look as interesting to the eye. And there I am outlining a shape that I'm going to fill in later. So keeping in mind where the light source is, you're going to want thicker lines away from your light source, implying a shadow, and thinner lines toward your light source, which would indicate, more light is hitting it. And here, just doing subtle hatching makes his chest armor look layered and not just a flat piece. And going in, just giving his muscles a lot more depth. And even coming out of these shadow areas here, what I like to do is do what's called feathering, and that doesn't make the shape seem as blocky, and instead it'll look like a nice subtle gradient, uh, even though it's just a bunch of line work, and up close it will look like a mess, but from a distance, at the way the art is actually meant to be seen, it will read much better. And there I am going back and forth over lines. Uh, and that's just to give that variance I was talking about. And I keep switching up the pens that I use, and once I get better with a brush, I will show you that too. Right now my brushwork is very thick and silver agey, and here I didn't pencil in a lot of details on the shoulder armor that he has. Instead, I relied a little bit on intuition. Because we want to create a metallic texture, I would recommend also seeing how other artists that you admire portray metal. certainly if you're portraying a chrome look as opposed to, say, a battle-hardened metal, you're going to want more of a sheen, more reflections in the metal. And so when you're inking, especially a character like Steel, who's primarily metal, you're going to want to pay attention to the different textures within, and also referencing a particular era of costume. I happen to like this costume of Steel's the most when I was doing research from the video. So I uh, started looking at, okay, Steel has to have like some chromes, some more hardened steels, and also more of kind of the standard superhero material. I obviously not into fashion design, so I wouldn't know what terms to use. It's like, oh, this is metal and this is a spandexy cloth, whatever. But the I guess more spandex area, I'm just using standard feathering on like you would for any human form, not bothering to add reflections or anything like that of the environment. And here I am just feathering and probably doing my most feathering work on this piece to come out of that shadow and have it look nice. And here just adding a little bit of extra ripple because Steel works out way more than I do and he needs to show that off. But his hand here is very metallic, so I'm adding in the highlights and darkness again. And you don't really add highlights when inking. You add the dark areas around them, and the areas that you leave blank are the highlights. Now, there's no excuse not to use tools, uh, such as a roller, because his hammer is an essential part of his character. So you really are going to want to get that right. And I go back and forth over the line because sometimes I find if you just ink once with a roller, your line is kind of flat and gnarled and a little bit crunchy. So going back and forth over that helps that. And I actually inked this with a 08 marker because I wanted it to stand out apart from him. And when I do the feathering here, I make sure that all the lines are curved upward, so that reinforces the cylindrical shape of his hammer. And again, I use the 005 marker, micron, excuse me, to fill that in. And it's a wonderful contrast with the 08. And back to the 03, where we're defining the body once again. And when you're defining the body and doing line work like that, you're going to want to try to use as long a stroke as you can manage, and uh, practice and work up to it. It'll give your art a much cleaner appearance. And yes, there are smudge marks all over the page, and that's what they invented erasers for, so I'm not that worried about it. And here, with the inking of the leg, even though the human body is very curved, I try to use a lot of geometrically straight lines, especially on more powerful male figures. It gives more of an imposing sense and reads to the eye as a little more threatening. And yes, Steel is a hero, and he is also a very metallic character as well. I mean, thus the name Steel. So I wanted to give him kind of that machine edge as he's working. And for the curve of his boot, I use a French curve. Again, use your tools. You can definitely freehand it if you have the skill. It's not that wide of a curve, but I would encourage everyone to just take a moment or two and not rush through their work. And yeah, this is an extra time-lapsed version. I wish I could work at this speed. But yeah, the inking here, just follow along with the lines that you or your penciler has given, but don't trace. Your job is not to trace, because we have the technology now just to scan in pencils and call it good. Your job as the inker is to embellish and to tell a story and to refine pencils. So here I go now with a I think I got this pen as a part of a art class that I took a while back, but yeah, it's not the highest quality of ink. But since I'm scanning this piece in, it's not meant for fine art. But yeah, I don't actually rush through this process because you can erase a line or go over a line unintentionally and leave kind of a weird blobby mess where a refined shape had been previously. And when that happens, just go in with a white gel pen and start correcting those mistakes. And you can use it to add effects too, but like here, the shape was kind of destroyed by my own inking, so I just go back in and add that curve, fixing up a little bits of the cape down at the bottom, and now go in and I use a Statler eraser and just go to town cleaning up your piece. Wait till your ink is completely dry, and there you'll have your finished work. Well, thank you for watching. I'm pretty happy with how this turned out, and I'll be doing a digital coloring tutorial of steel later. So thank you, and keep telling those stories.